The Constitution, Lecture 4. In the last lecture, we began our discussion of Article 1, which concerned Congress, and we talked about some of the concerns that the founders had about how to construct a legislative branch that would stay within its proper limits and at the same time make good laws by deliberating properly. In this lecture, we finally get to the lawmaking powers of Congress, which come in Article 1, Section 8. So remember, the Constitution, in the Constitution, the federal government is subject to the principle of enumerated powers, meaning that the federal government is only supposed to exercise those powers explicitly granted to it in the Constitution. That's why Article 1 begins by saying all legislative power herein granted is vested in a Congress of the United States. In other words, not all legislative power, but only the legislative power that's explicitly granted is vested in Congress. And those powers are listed in Section 8, which in your book, in this book, or it's pages 546 through 548. And in some ways, this is really the heart of the Constitution, because since the fundamental act of the government is to make laws, so that the other branches can adjudicate and execute them. That's the basic power of government. And so this section, Article 1, Section 8, lays out what Congress can make laws about. And again, since this is the national government or the federal government, the main point is that Congress is given the power to make laws in those areas that are of genuinely national importance, either because national unity is required, in areas such as money, commercial, interstate commerce, weights and measures, and things like that. So of national importance because of uniformity, or because they deal with a task that has a genuinely national scope, such as, the post office, the Army, and the Navy. Okay, so important powers. Clause 1, Congress is given the power to tax. But duties, imposts, and excises need to be uniform, meaning you can't tax those rates can't be different from state to state so that you play favorite with certain states. The federal government has the power to borrow money on the credit of the United States. So in other words, to borrow money from private investors or to borrow money from other nations. And by the way, this illustrates the principle of enumerated powers, because you might think, well, it's obvious that government should be able to borrow money, but they would say for the state governments, yeah, that would be obvious, but not with regard to the federal government. The federal government can only borrow money if it's given the power to do so. Then next, there come some important economic powers. So for example, in Clause 3, Congress can regulate interstate and international commerce. So all rules regarding international trade in terms of tariffs or quotas or fees or anything like that, those are determined by Congress. And also any regulations concerning the exchange of goods and services across state lines. Also, Clause 4 gives Congress the power to establish national bankruptcy laws. So that basically you go bankrupt the same way wherever you are in the country. They have the power in Clause 5 to establish a uniform national currency. And also in Clause 8, they can grant patents and copyrights to encourage useful inventions. According to Clause 5, Congress is given the power to determine who can become a citizen and how. So it's the power of naturalization. Congress in Clause 9 is given the power to establish all inferior federal courts. So the federal court, the actual structure, and we'll get to this in a later lecture, the actual structure of the federal court system is not laid out in the Constitution. All the Constitution says is that there will be a Supreme Court. But Congress actually, through its judiciary acts, organizes how many layers of lower courts there are before the Supreme Court, and how many actual courts, like districts and circuits there are. So Congress actually organizes the judicial branch for the most part. And Congress actually does the same thing with the executive branch. All of the various executive departments and agencies that the president and his appointees are in charge of, all of those agencies and departments are actually created through congressional legislation. Because otherwise the president would be able to design his own executive branch, and that's too much power. Then Article 1, Section 8 also gives Congress important military powers. Congress has the power to declare war. So in other words, both the House and the Senate, at least a majority of both the House and the Senate, have to approve a declaration of war for the United States to be officially at war. Congress also funds the military, and it organizes the military, both in terms of the code of military justice, but also the command structure, the size, the budget. So basically, although the president is the commander in chief of the armed forces are organized, populated, and funded through congressional legislation and appropriation. But then on page 548, you get an interesting other clause that is referred to either as the necessary and proper clause or sometimes colloquially as the elastic clause. This is 548. Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution and the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So why is that needed? You might say, well, wait a second, I thought we were supposed to enumerate the powers, and now you're just saying, well, and any other laws that are necessary and proper can be made. But no, the logic behind the necessary and proper clause is that if you give Congress a task, you must allow it the proper means to achieve that task. So if Congress has the right to tax, then that implies other powers that are necessary in order to do that. So Congress has to have the power to, hire tax collectors, to create some agency that is responsible for distributing and collecting tax forms, and so on and so forth. There are lots of various kind of details of governing that can't necessarily be dictated ahead of time, right? So you can't say Congress has the power to tax, but it doesn't have any power to develop a department that can collect those taxes. But so instead of trying to micromanage by listing, which will never work, but instead of trying to list every single possible conceivable power that Congress might need to have in order to do its job, you just give them the main goals, the main ends. And then that clause says, and therefore Congress will have the power through legislation to, do what is necessary to achieve those ends. Because remember, the necessary and proper clause, the language says, shall to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So it's not a blank check to just make any other laws they feel like doing. They have to be laws that are necessary and proper for fulfilling some task that's been explicitly given in Article 1, Section 8, or elsewhere. But of course, this is still, you can see how this is, an ambiguous standard. Who decides what's necessary and proper? I mean, obviously Congress itself, which means that Congress could, at least in principle, use this clause to justify quite a lot of governmental expansion. And there's actually a debate about this in the very first Washington administration, where Hamilton argued that the creation of a national bank was necessary and proper for carrying into effect a number of the government's tasks that are laid out in the Constitution, whereas Jefferson argued, no, it is neither necessary nor proper to create an exclusive national bank. So in the very first Washington administration, some of the most experienced and knowledgeable of the founders disagreed over what the necessary and proper clause entailed. Obviously, there's certain, clearly, this can't be used to justify arbitrary rule or anything like that. But this is necessarily elastic. This is necessarily a little bit of a vague standard, because you cannot make a rule ahead of time for everything. There has to be room for legislatures to use some discretion, not regarding the ends they're supposed to serve. It's not that it should be up to the discretion of Congress whether they do or do not protect the life, liberty, and property of citizens. Of course, they have to protect the life, liberty, and property of citizens, but they need a certain amount of discretion in figuring out the best way to go about doing that. And that's what the necessary and proper clause creates for Congress. Now, we move on to Section 9. If Section 8 gives powers, Section 9 of Article 1 is limitations on the powers of the federal government. And there are some important ones here that with regard to, say, suspending of habeas corpus, no bills of attainder, no ex post facto laws, states must be treated uniformly, and so on. It's also in this area that Congress is authorized to ban the slave trade, that is the importation of slaves from foreign countries. in 1808, which Congress did. And another important thing in Section 9, is Clause 7, which is at the bottom of page 548, where it says, all money drawn from the Treasury must be approved by representatives. So in other words, no government official of any branch of the federal government can spend actual money without Congress having approved it. And the accounts have to be published so that everybody can find out how Congress is spending the people's money. So it's not just that Congress makes budgets, it's that Congress has to specifically approve all expenditures. So that way it is representatives of the people who are approving the expenditures. Now, Section 10 gives specific limitations on not the federal government, but on the states and their powers. States are forbidden to do things that would interfere with the national government carrying out its enumerated powers. And I mentioned a lot of these before, that they can't. Well, let me read it to you just so that you can see the various things that are listed. That's probably a more useful way to do things. So this is on page 549. No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, right? So only the federal government can commit the states to those kinds of relationships with foreign countries. Shall not grant letters of marque and reprisal. Don't need to talk about that. No state shall coin money, so only the federal government's responsible for currency. Emit bills of credit. Make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. Pass any bill of attainder. That's where you basically pass a bill punishing somebody for a crime without them having actually received a fair trial. No ex post facto law. That is, you can't punish people for doing something that was not illegal at the time they did it. They can't make any law impairing the obligation of contracts. So they can't pass state legislation to dissolve contracts, can't grant any title of nobility. So states are not allowed to create aristocratic ranks. This has to be a republic. And then there are a bunch of other things that we don't necessarily need to get into. But just to reiterate the notion of reserved powers, these restrictions on state power are made explicit because of the assumption that the states are assumed to retain all the powers that their constitutions have given them, unless the Constitution explicitly forbids them. So unless a power of government is taken away or denied to the states, it is assumed that the states retain it. And so that's why you've got to go through and say things like, so the president negotiates treaties and the Senate ratifies them, and states are not allowed to get engaged in treaties. So you've got to do both things. Now, so whereas the federal government can tax, but Article 1, Section 10 does not prohibit the states from taxing, so states can tax too. Since the power is not explicitly taken away, it is retained. Because remember, each state already had a constitution. Each state already had a government. The national constitution, the federal constitution, is placed on top of that. But the understanding is, in adding a higher level of government, you're not taking away anything from the lower levels unless it explicitly is said so, unless it's necessary in order for the national government to carry out national tasks. And that's it for this lecture, because I don't want to make these too long. So there will be several of them, but hopefully from here on out they'll be shorter. In the next lecture, I'm going to move on to Article 2, which is about the executive branch and especially about the president.